Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel, and if you're new to the channel, well, you picked a great day to pop along because it's the A to ZX of the spectrum. That's correct, more 8-bit classics from the 80s for you to view, and this week we're on to the letter P. Now I wonder what classics we've got coming up for you this week. Well, if you want to find out, you just wait until after these titles. So for the first game in the letter P, we're going to have Pip Fighter, which was published by Dolmark in 1990, and it's another one of those examples where they should never have tried to put this game onto a ZX Spectrum. Now, we were never going to have the sort of ultra realistic digitised graphics that we saw in the arcade machine. Well, ultra realistic for the time anyway. But I will say this for the Spectrum port, one of the things that it did do well, it was the graphics. We had wonderful big sprites that looked, well, almost the part for an 8-bit microcomputer. Where of course the game falls down as well in the playability. There's just so much happening on the screen that it's very slow and very sluggish, and each input seems to take an eternity to execute. Now of course, playing a one-player game against the computer, well, you were never likely going to be able to win at this game, and quite simply because the CPU was much faster than you. But of course it did have a two-player option, so you and a friend could actually sit down with either two joysticks or both sets of hands on the keyboard and try and battle it out on this very impressive game for the time. And the ZX Spectrum version did try to emulate as much of the arcade as it could. I mean, your character could move away from the screen and back towards the screen, left and right movement, and the scrolling, well, typical ZX Spectrum scrolling, so it was a bit janky at times. But nonetheless, the developers did put into the game as much as they possibly could. But as for recommending anyone playing this game today, well, only if you were a big fan of Pip Fighter back in the day, and maybe you want to see what some of the other ports were like. Because let me tell you, no matter what home system you were playing on, the port was going to be nothing like the arcade cab. But if it's something that you must experience for yourself from a purely academic point of view, then go ahead and try Pip Fighter on the ZX Spectrum. But just don't expect it to impress you too much. It does of course have its charm, but that's about as far as it goes. And that was Pip Fighter, published by Dolmark in 1990. Second up for the letter P, we have Prison Riot, brought to us by Players Software in 1990, and this is a game that I didn't play back in the day, and in fact this is a game I've only recently picked up thanks to a friend of the channel. But let me tell you, this is definitely the type of game I would have played to the death back in the day. It's your typical arcade adventure game, a run and gun exploration game, very much in the style of the Joe Blade games, which were extremely popular back in the day. Now in Prison Riot, you play a prison guard, and 7 prisoners have instigated a riot, and you only have 15 minutes to get to the roof to defuse their booby traps before this incident turns into a full-scale riot. Now as I said, this game is very much in the style of Joe Blade, so you walk from screen to screen, but there's also doors leading up and down, so in many ways it's an early 3D maze exploration type of game. But of course, with the prisoners out of their cells, it's also a bit of a shooter. Now you do have very limited ammo in this game, because the point of the game isn't so much run and gun, but to run as fast as you can and quickly find the main instigators of the riot. Now where this game got a little bit different, well, it was in the boss fights. As I said, this game gave you limited ammo, so you often didn't have any ammo at all by the time you reached the boss fight. Instead of it turning into a simple shootout like most games of this genre, well, you had to solve a word puzzle, and to be frankly honest, I don't think I've ever seen a game in this genre with that kind of mechanic for a boss fight. Other plus points for this game are, well, the graphics and controls. The game looks wonderful and just simply oozes charm, and the controls, well, they're very tight, and I had no problem whatsoever navigating the maze. So Prison Riot, a game I would recommend today? Absolutely, because this type of game was the epitome of gameplay on the ZX Spectrum and other 8-bit microcomputers of the time. So if you do get a chance to get your hands on this game, then I absolutely heartily recommend Prison Riot from Players Software in 1990. Third up for the letter P, we have Predator, published by Activision in 1987, and of course it's a licensed game based on the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie of the same name. Now the first thing you're going to notice about the game is the cutscene at the beginning, and I don't think I'd ever seen a cutscene on an 8-bit microcomputer before, certainly not to my memory anyway. But of course we're here to talk about the game and not just the cutscene, as splendid as that cutscene was. So Predator on the ZX Spectrum was the same as it was in every other 8-bit system that it was ported to. It was an action running gun shooter where, well, you took control of Dutch and you had to run through the jungle taking down each and every enemy that came across your path, and then of course avoiding the titular Predator. Now I'll be absolutely honest with you, this game is just perhaps a tad too hard, and even back in 1987 when the game was released, well, the reviews were pretty much the same. It looks great, it gets 7 out of 10, but was considered just a bit too hard to be properly addictive. Now on the ZX Spectrum game, I would imagine much like all the other systems it was ported to, absolutely everything on the screen can and will kill you, from obviously the enemy soldiers and of course the Predator, to even things like what look like birds flying towards you. Now ammo of course is sparse, but there are pickups along the way, and you do have 3 grenades. But of course the point of the game is to track down and kill eventually the Predator, and the only way you can do that is, well, with the laser rifle that you will find eventually. But as I've said, the game is so hard, not many people actually got that far in the game. And during the time that I've taken to record this gameplay footage, well, I could barely get past the first couple of screens. So yes, it does look good and it doesn't play too badly, but it's definitely the difficulty level that kills this game. And would I recommend anyone playing it today? Well, if you're a big hardcore Arnie fan or a Predator fan, then definitely you get your hands on this game and you play it just so you can say you've done so. And also, it would be a nice addition in your collection. But other than that, well, no, if you've got no interest in Arnie or Predator, then I would just avoid this one completely. There are far better running gun shooters out there in the ZX Spectrum and other 8-bit micros, making this one pretty much redundant if you don't have a particular interest in the license. And that is Predator, published by Activision in 1987. Our penultimate game in the letter P is Konami's 1985 game Ping Pong. Yes, a Konami game, and we all know what Konami's famous for. Well, they're famous for just about everything. So why not in 1985 should they release a game like Ping Pong? Because let's face it, Pong, or table tennis, was probably the first ever commercially available video game, going right back to 1972's Magnavox Odyssey, and of course improved on by Atari's world famous Pong. Now of course by the time Konami get their hands on a table tennis game or a ping pong game in 1985, well, things have improved quite dramatically. No longer do we have 2 white sticks and a bouncing white ball. No, now Konami can actually put in the table. So we have a table with a net, and not only that, we also have fans at either side who will cheer you on if you score a point. Now of course it wasn't just the graphics that improved by the time Konami decided to put out a table tennis game. The gameplay itself was far superior. The paddles look like paddles and they kind of operate like paddles. You have 3 different shots that can be performed either forehand or backhand, and all of which you will absolutely need to master if you want to beat the CPU. Now of course beating the CPU was no mean feat back in the day because, well, obviously the computer could probably think just a little bit faster even in the 8-bit days. But what made this game truly great? Well, it was another 2-player game. A game where you and your best buddy could go head to head and see just exactly who was the best ping pong player. I absolutely recommend this game 100% to anyone who hasn't played it, and if you have played it, you need to go back and play it again, because this is an outstanding table tennis game, and that is Ping Pong from Konami in 1985. Last up for the letter P is of course Atari's wonderful Paperboy, released by Ultimate in 1986 for the ZX Spectrum, and let me tell you, this is probably one of the best ports of an arcade game that I ever played on the Spectrum. Now you're probably asking, why is it such a good port? Is it, well, because of the graphics? Well no, the graphics were pretty much standard Spectrum graphics. You had monochromatic screens, the scrolling wasn't extremely smooth, and it was nowhere near as detailed as the arcade counterpart. So you ask, was it the sound? Well no, the sound was fairly standard Spectrum sound. So what was it that made this such a good port? Well, it was the gameplay. Well, you see, for the first time ever I could actually make progress in this game. Back in the day, Paperboy was an absolute coin guzzling arcade machine. Well, they all were, because that was the nature of the business. But when they ported it to the ZX Spectrum, well, they got the port right. The difficulty wasn't ramped up, it wasn't kept the same, it was brought down, it was made a much more playable game. Because once you had it in the ZX Spectrum, well, they didn't require you to pump coin after coin in. No, they let you just totally enjoy this game. Now that doesn't mean it was just too easy, no, it still had a decent level of difficulty that would of course frustrate you from time to time, but it was nowhere near the arcade's level of frustration, which for me made it much more enjoyable, despite the fact that I didn't have the handlebars to control the game with, which was one of the main selling points on the arcade. So obviously from what you've heard so far, yes of course I recommend you playing this game on the ZX Spectrum. Now I haven't played it on other 8-bit microcomputers or any other 8-bit or 16-bit consoles, but I would imagine, considering the nature of this particular port, that they would all be along the same vein. So yes, definitely if you get the opportunity, pick up Paperboy in the ZX Spectrum and give it a go and revisit one of those timeless arcade games that were just designed to be fun, as well as a little bit frustrating from time to time. Atari and Midway's Paperboy, published by Ultimate in 1986. So there we have it, my friends, another selection of 5 games from the ZX Spectrum era, and all from the letter P. And yes, there were some classics in there, I'm sure you'll agree. And you know what, if you don't agree, well, that's what the comments are for. If you want to talk about any of the games that you've seen today, well, you just hit me up in the comments, because I love nothing more than to chat about these old games, well, from my past anyway. And of course, if you've enjoyed this video, well, throw me a thumbs up on the way out, because it makes a great deal of difference to the channel, but more importantly, it makes a great deal of difference to me. And if you don't want to miss any future videos, well, that subscription button, it's always there, it's always free, and you can always change your mind. But thanks again for watching, and until next time, cheerio.